The warning klaxons had been screaming for 3 hours straight. Commander Sarah stood on the bridge of the TDF Tempest, watching the tactical display paint their doom in bright red icons. 63 warships were burning toward their position, and her fleet had maybe 20 vessels that could still fire their weapons. The rest were cargo haulers, medical ships, and research vessels like hers that had been pressed into military service because humanity was running out of options. "Ma'am, the Vanguard will be in firing range in 40 minutes, Lieutenant Torres said from the sensor station. His voice was steady, but Sarah could see his hands shaking. He was 23 years old. Most of her crew was young. The experienced officers were already dead, scattered across a dozen losing battles in the outer colonies. Sarah had been a weather researcher 6 months ago. She'd spent her career chasing storms across Earth's oceans, measuring wind speeds and atmospheric pressure, writing papers that maybe 1,000 people would ever read. Then the had arrived, and suddenly the military needed every ship and every warm body. The Tempest had been studying climate patterns on colonial worlds. Now it had missiles bolted to its hull, and a crew that barely knew which end of a plasma rifle to point at the enemy. "Admiral is ordering all non-combat vessels to retreat to the evacuation zone," the communications officer reported. "We're supposed to fall back behind the defense line." Sarah looked at the display again. The defense line was a joke: 3 heavy cruisers and a handful of destroyers against 63 ships. The cruisers would last maybe 10 minutes. Then they would sweep through and hit the civilian transports that were still trying to evacuate the colonies. 30,000 people were on those transports, families, children. "Belay that order," Sarah said quietly. "All stations prepare for atmospheric entry." The bridge went silent. Everyone turned to look at her. "Ma'am," Torres said, "the planet 442b. "That's right." "Commander, that's a world. The storm's there." "I know what they are, Lieutenant. I've studied that planet for 5 years. Sarah pulled up a new screen on the tactical display. It showed 442b rotating below them, its surface almost entirely covered by swirling white clouds. "There's a superstorm forming on the eastern hemisphere. It's already 3,000 kilometers wide and growing." Her tactical officer, a former Marine named, frowned at the display. "You want to hide in the storm?" "No," Sarah said. "I want to make it bigger." The crew stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had, but she'd been looking at the data for the last hour, running calculations in her head, and she kept coming back to the same impossible idea. Humans had been studying Earth's weather for centuries. They'd learned to seed clouds, to disperse hurricanes, to predict the paths of tornadoes. They'd never weaponized a storm before, but that was only because they'd never needed to. They had better ships, better weapons, better everything. But they came from a world with calm seas and gentle breezes. They barely had weather. They'd conquered 100 planets, but none of them had been like Earth. None of them had taught their inhabitants to respect the power of water and wind. "Listen to me," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the bridge. "The Tempest isn't a warship. We don't have the guns to fight them straight up. But we have atmospheric processors, electromagnetic field generators, and enough cloud seeding equipment to change the weather on a small continent. That storm down there is already the biggest thing in the system. We're going to make it angry, lead the into it, and let the planet do what Earth has been doing to humans for millions of years." "That's insane," someone whispered. "Yeah," Sarah agreed. "But so is fighting a war against an empire that's been conquering worlds since before humans discovered fire. We're already doing the insane thing. This is just a different flavor of crazy." Was studying the tactical display, his expression thoughtful. "They will follow us. They won't let us escape. I'm counting on it. We make them think we're running scared, diving for the planet to try a gravity sling maneuver. They'll chase us because that's what predators do. They've been hunting us across 10 systems. They won't stop now." Torres pulled up atmospheric data on his screen. "Commander, if we're going to do this, we need to time it perfectly. The storm is growing, but it's not at peak intensity yet, and the wind patterns are still stabilizing. How long until it peaks? Maybe 6 hours, maybe less. The models are having trouble predicting it because the storm is already outside normal parameters. Sarah smiled grimly. Then we have 6 hours to convince them to follow us into hell. She opened a channel to the other research vessels in the fleet. Most of them had been part of her original survey mission, back when studying weather patterns had seemed like important work. Now they were the only ships in the system with the equipment to pull off her plan. This is Commander to all atmospheric research vessels. I'm transmitting coordinates for 442B. We're going to deploy every piece of weather modification equipment we have. I need you to trust me on this. There was a pause. Then Dr. Park's voice came through from the science vessel horizon. Sarah, I see what you're looking at. That superstorm. You want to feed it. I want to make it into something the galaxy has never seen before. They will think we're running. Let them think that. How much seeding compound do you have left? Enough to cloud seed half a planet, if we had the time. We were supposed to be studying rainfall patterns on the northern continent. Sarah felt something tight in her chest loosen just a little. Good. Get your ship ready for atmospheric entry. We go in 15 minutes. The next 15 minutes were chaos. Sarah's crew worked frantically to prepare the Tempest for atmospheric flight. They weren't a combat vessel, but they'd been built for rough conditions. Every human ship was built tough because Earth had taught humanity that nature didn't care about your blueprints. Ships had redundant systems, compartmentalized hulls, and enough manual overrides that you could fly them with half the computers dead. It was by galactic standards, but humans had learned that lesson the hard way. The fleet was closing fast. Sarah could see them on the display, their ships moving in perfect formation. They were beautiful in a terrible way, all sleek lines and deadly efficiency. They'd been conquering worlds when humanity was still figuring out agriculture. Their tactics had been refined over thousands of years. But they'd never fought humans before. They didn't know what it meant to come from a world that tried to kill you every single day. All ships, this is Commander, begin descent on my mark, make it look panicked. I want them to think we're desperate. We are desperate, muttered. Yeah, but they don't need to know we have a plan. Sarah took a breath. Mark, all ships dive, dive, dive. The Tempest's engines flared and the ship dropped toward 442B. Behind them, the other research vessels followed, along with a handful of cargo ships that had nowhere else to go. On the tactical display, Sarah watched the fleet react exactly as she'd hoped. They broke formation slightly, their fastest ships surging forward to cut off the retreat. They're taking the bait, Torres said. The planet rushed up to meet them. Sarah had studied 442B from orbit for months, but she'd never actually entered the atmosphere. The clouds were thicker than Earth's, the air heavy with moisture. The Tempest shook as they hit the upper atmosphere, and the temperature readings started climbing. Entering the storm system, Torres reported. Wind speeds at 300 kilometers per hour and rising. The ship bucked and twisted. Sarah gripped her chair as the Tempest was buffeted by winds that could tear a smaller vessel apart. But the ship held. Human engineering at its finest, built by people who understood that sometimes nature was going to hit you and you just had to take it. Deploy the atmospheric processors, Sarah ordered. I want them pumping particulates into the clouds. Target the storm's fuel source. Make it grow faster. The crew worked their stations. The Tempest had been designed to study storms, not create them, but the equipment was adaptable. Atmospheric processors began releasing carefully calculated compounds into the clouds, altering the chemical composition of the storm. Electromagnetic generators started firing, disturbing the planet's natural magnetic field in ways that would make the storm angrier. On Earth, humans had learned to disperse hurricanes by disrupting their formation. Sarah was doing the opposite. She was feeding the storm everything it needed to grow into something monstrous. "They are entering the upper atmosphere," reported. "They're still following us." "Good, take us deeper. Head for the eye of the storm." The tempest dove into the clouds. Around them, the world became a screaming chaos of wind and water. Lightning flashed constantly, each bolt carrying more energy than a weapon's strike. The ship's shields flared as they absorbed the impact. On Earth, Sarah had flown into hurricanes dozens of times. She knew how to read the patterns, how to find the paths of least resistance through the chaos. The didn't. They were flying blind, following the tempest's sensor signature because their prey was escaping and they couldn't let that happen. It was instinct. It was pride. It was exactly what Sarah was counting on. "Storm intensity increasing," Tors called out. "Wind speeds now at 500 kilometers per hour. The electromagnetic readings are off the charts." Sarah watched her screens. The storm was growing faster than her models had predicted. The compounds they were seeding into the clouds were acting like fuel on a fire. The electromagnetic disturbances were creating feedback loops that made the whole system more unstable. It was beautiful and terrible and completely insane. "Ma'am, the Horizon is reporting successful deployment of their seeding arrays. Dr. Park says the storm should reach critical mass in the next 2 hours." 2 hours. Sarah hoped they could survive that long. She hoped they would stay in the atmosphere long enough to see what happened when you chased humans into the kind of weather that made Earth's worst hurricanes look like gentle breezes. "All ships maintain your positions. Stay in formation. We're going to lead them right into the heart of this thing." The tempest shook again as another massive gust hit them. Sarah felt the deck tilt beneath her feet. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered if this was how humanity would be remembered. Not as a great warrior species, but as the idiots who thought they could fight a war with weather. But then she looked at her crew, young and scared but still at their stations, and she knew they'd follow her into the storm, because that's what humans did. They looked at the impossible and they tried anyway. They were right behind them, massive warships diving through clouds that were growing darker and more violent with every passing second. They had weapons that could crack planets. They had shields that could withstand almost anything. But they'd never faced a storm that humans had made angry on purpose. Sarah smiled. "Let's show them what weather can do." The War Admiral Al watched the fleeing human vessels on his tactical display with satisfaction. The prey was running, diving for the planet in a desperate attempt to escape. It was a classic maneuver, using the gravity well for a slingshot trajectory that might, if they were lucky, give them enough speed to reach the jump point before his faster ships caught them. They would not be lucky. Al had been hunting prey across the galaxy for 40 years. He knew every trick, every desperate last gambit that defeated species tried when they realized they were going to die. The humans were no different. They'd fought bravely, he'd give them that, but bravery meant nothing against superior technology and tactics. "All ships maintain pursuit," he commanded. "I want their engines disabled, not destroyed. The Dominion wants prisoners for study." His tactical officer, a younger named, studied the sensor readings. "War Admiral, the atmospheric conditions on that planet are highly unstable. Perhaps we should wait for them to emerge and intercept them in orbit." Al's crest flared in irritation. "And give them time to escape. No, we pursue. Our ships can handle a little wind and rain." The lead elements of his fleet entered 442b's atmosphere. The planet was a water world, its surface almost entirely ocean. The humans seemed to like those kinds of worlds. There was mostly water too, though Al had never seen it. Earth was deep in human territory and the war hadn't reached that far yet. It would, eventually. The Dominion always won. The clouds were thicker than expected. Al's ship, the Reaper of Worlds, shuddered as it hit a pocket of turbulence. Nothing serious, just some atmospheric disturbance. His shields easily absorbed the impact. "Maintain formation," he ordered. "Don't lose sight of the prey." The human ships were diving deeper into the atmosphere, heading toward what appeared to be a large storm system. Al could see it on the sensors, a swirling mass of clouds that covered a significant portion of the planet's surface. The humans were probably hopping to hide in the storm, to mask their sensor signatures. Another desperate tactic. "Deploy atmospheric drones," he commanded. "I want full sensor coverage. They can't hide from us." The drones launched and spread out through the clouds. Almost immediately, they started sending back strange readings. The storm was larger than it had appeared from orbit, much larger, and it was growing. "War Admiral, I'm seeing unusual atmospheric patterns," reported. "The storm appears to be intensifying rapidly. The wind speeds are far higher than normal for this type of planetary system." "It's just weather," Al said dismissively. "Adjust shield frequencies to compensate. Continue pursuit." But as they went deeper, even Al had to admit the storm was more severe than expected. The Reaper of Worlds was being buffeted by winds that were starting to strain the shields. Lightning flashed constantly, bright enough to light up the clouds like daylight. Each strike made the sensors flicker. "Wind speeds now exceeding 400 kilometers per hour," reported, his voice uncertain. "War Admiral, this is approaching the upper limits of what our shields were designed to handle." "Then increase shield power. We're not turning back because of a little weather." On the display, Al could see his fleet starting to spread out. The smaller ships were having trouble maintaining formation in the turbulence. A few were falling behind, their engines struggling against the wind. But the human ships were still ahead, still running, and that meant they could be caught. They had conquered their first world 3,000 years ago. Since then, they'd taken 100 more. They'd fought species with superior weapons, species with greater numbers, species with technologies the Dominion had never seen. They'd won every time because they were patient, methodical, and overwhelming. They didn't take risks. They didn't need to. But they'd never fought a species from a storm world. They didn't understand what it meant to grow up on a planet where the weather could kill you as easily as any enemy. Their beautiful had gentle seasons and calm skies. Rain was a curiosity. Storms were something that happened on other, lesser worlds. Al had studied dozens of planets, conquered half that many, but he'd never studied Earth. Why would he? It was just another water world, unremarkable except for the unusually violent species that had evolved there. The humans were fierce fighters, but so were many species. They'd be defeated like all the others. The ship lurched violently. Al grabbed his command chair as the deck tilted. Alarms started blaring across the bridge. "Shield integrity at 70%, someone shouted. "We just took a lightning strike. The energy output was equivalent to a tactical plasma weapon." "Impossible," Al said. "Lightning doesn't carry that much power." "On our world, no. But War Admiral, this planet, the atmospheric conditions are extreme. The lightning here is far more powerful than—" Another strike hit the ship. The lights flickered. Al felt the deck shudder beneath his feet. On the tactical display, he saw two of his smaller escort ships suddenly veer off course, their engines failing. "All ships increase altitude," he ordered. "Get above the worst of the storm." But when they tried to climb, the winds pushed back. The Reaper of Worlds strained against the incredible force of the storm. The ship was massive, built to withstand weapons fire that could level cities, but it had never been designed to fight against a planet's atmosphere. "War Admiral, we're receiving distress calls from multiple ships. The destroyer Swift Death reports catastrophic hull damage. They're going down." Al stared at the display in disbelief. Going down, shot down by weather. It wasn't possible. Ships didn't fall out of the sky because of wind. Ships were shot down by weapons, by enemy fire, not by rain and lightning. "Where are the humans?" he demanded. "Still ahead of us, War Admiral. They're moving through the storm like they know where they're going." Of course they knew where they were going. They'd led the here deliberately. Al realized it with a cold certainty that made his combat instincts scream. This wasn't a retreat. This was a trap. All ships break off pursuit immediately, ascend to orbit. But it was too late. The storm had them now, and storms didn't let go easily. The Reaper of Worlds was being tossed like a toy in winds that exceeded anything in the databases. Around them, Al could see his fleet being torn apart. Ships collided as they lost control. Others simply broke apart, their hulls cracking under pressure differentials that switched from high to low in seconds. Lightning struck again and again. Each bolt carried enough energy to overwhelm shields, to fry systems, to turn sophisticated warships into dead metal falling toward the ocean below. Shields at 30%, hull breach on decks 7 through 12. Al gripped his command chair. He'd fought pirates, rebels, and desperate species making their last stand. He'd won battles where his fleet was outnumbered. He'd personally commanded the conquest of 6 worlds, but he'd never faced anything like this. The humans weren't fighting them with weapons. They were fighting them with weather, with wind and water and lightning, with the raw, undisciplined fury of a planet that they had assumed was just backdrop, just scenery, just empty space between the real threat and the ships. On his, weather was something you checked before going outside. On 442b, weather was a weapon that could destroy a fleet. Another ship disappeared from his tactical display. Then another. The storm was eating his fleet alive, and there was nothing he could do about it. His weapons were useless. His shields were failing. His ships were being destroyed by a force they couldn't fight, couldn't negotiate with, couldn't understand. In the chaos, through the lightning and the screaming wind, Al caught a glimpse of one of the human ships. It was riding the storm currents, adjusting to every gust, reading the chaos like it was a language. The ship's movements were confident, almost casual, as if flying through a superstorm was just another day's work. And Al realized with horror what he was seeing. These humans, these desperate prey animals, they weren't scared of the storm. They were at home in it. This wasn't a trap they'd stumbled into by accident. This was their environment. This was where they felt safe. War Admiral, the command ship domination is breaking apart, there. The transmission cut off. Al watched the domination, one of the pride ships of the fleet, get torn into pieces by wind shear. Pieces of hull plating spun away into the clouds. The crew capsules ejected, but they were immediately caught by the wind and thrown kilometers away in seconds. All remaining ships, Al said, his voice hollow. Emergency ascent, full power, get out of the atmosphere by any means necessary. The Reaper of Worlds turned and began climbing. Every meter was a fight against winds that wanted to push them back down. Lightning struck the ship 3 more times. Each impact felt like a hammer blow. But slowly, painfully, they began to rise. Behind them, the storm continued to grow. Al could see it on the sensors even through the interference. The storm was massive now, covering nearly half the planet, and it was still intensifying. The humans had done something to it, fed it somehow, made it into a weapon specifically designed to kill ships that weren't built to handle Earth-like weather. The Reaper of Worlds finally broke through the cloud layer and into the upper atmosphere. Around them, what was left of the fleet emerged in 1s and 2s. Ships that had been beautiful and deadly were now battered wrecks, trailing atmosphere and debris. Of the 63 ships that had entered the atmosphere, 21 emerged. 42 ships and all their crews were gone, destroyed not by enemy fire but by wind, water, and lightning. The greatest defeat in military history, and they hadn't lost a single ship to weapons. They'd lost to weather. Al looked at the tactical display. Somewhere down in that storm, the human ships were still there, still intact, still dangerous. The prey had become the predator, and they were the ones running. "Get me a channel to High Command," Al said quietly. "Tell them we need reinforcements. Tell them," he paused, trying to find words for what he'd just experienced. "Tell them the humans can weaponize planets. Tell them we're not fighting a normal species. We're fighting something that survived conditions we can't even imagine." On the screen, the storm continued to grow. Al wondered what kind of world could produce a species that looked at and thought it was a weapon. What kind of evolution created beings that were more comfortable in chaos than in calm? Earth, he realized. That storm world they called home. The planet that other species looked at and saw a barely habitable nightmare. The humans had grown up there, had thrived there, and now they were teaching the galaxy what it meant to fight a species that considered Category 5 hurricanes a seasonal nuisance. The war wasn't over. The Dominion had more ships, more resources. But for the first time in his 40-year career, Al doubted that victory was certain. Because how did you conquer a species that could turn the sky itself into a weapon? Commander Sarah brought the tempest through the eye of the storm, that strange pocket of calm in the center of the chaos. Around them, the walls of the storm rose like mountains made of clouds, rotating with a power that would have terrified anyone who hadn't grown up studying Earth's hurricanes. To Sarah, it was familiar. Dangerous, yes, but understandable. "Status report," she called out. "Hull integrity at 85%, reported. "We've got some damage to the port shields, and we lost 2 of the atmospheric processors, but overall we're in good shape." The other ships. Horizon reports minor damage, same with the forecast and the climate survey. The cargo ships are hurt worse, but they're still flying. We didn't lose anyone. Sarah let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. They'd survived. Against all odds, against an empire that had been conquering worlds for, her little fleet of research vessels had survived. What about the... Tors pulled up the sensor data. "It's hard to get clear readings through the storm, but I'm showing maybe 20 ships that made it out of the atmosphere. The rest," he paused. "Ma'am, I think the rest are gone." 40 ships, 40 warships destroyed by weather. Sarah felt a strange mixture of triumph and horror. She'd known the storm would be dangerous. She'd counted on it. But seeing the actual results, knowing that thousands of crew members had just died because she'd made a storm angrier, it was different from the abstract idea. But then she thought about the colonies, about the 30,000 civilians in the evacuation transports, about Earth itself sitting in the crosshairs. They had come to conquer. They destroyed human settlements without mercy. This was war, and in war, you used every weapon you had. "The fleet is retreating," said. "They're moving to a high orbit. I don't think they want anything to do with this planet anymore." Can't say I blame them. Sarah looked at the storm data on her screen. The superstorm was at peak intensity now, a swirling nightmare of wind and lightning that covered 3,000 kilometers. It would last for weeks, maybe months, before finally dissipating. "What's the status of our defense fleet?" "Admiral is requesting a status update. They saw the retreat. They're asking what happened." Sarah smiled tiredly. "Tell them the weather happened. Tell them to hold position and be ready in case they decide to come back." But she didn't think they would. Not to this planet anyway. They had learned a hard lesson today. They'd learned that humans didn't just fight with guns and missiles. They fought with everything they had, including the planets themselves. Over the next few hours, Sarah coordinated with the other ships to bring them safely out of the storm. It required careful timing and precise navigation. One by one, they emerged into the upper atmosphere and then into orbit. The fleet watched from a distance but didn't approach. When the Tempest finally reached orbit, Sarah got a clear look at the enemy fleet. The ships were battered, many of them venting atmosphere or showing obvious hull damage. They were holding position in a defensive formation, but they weren't moving to attack. They looked beaten. "Ma'am, we're getting a transmission from the flagship," the communications officer said, sounding surprised. "They're requesting a ceasefire." Sarah blinked. "A ceasefire? They want to negotiate." "That's what they're saying. They're asking for a temporary cessation of hostilities while they recover their survivors from the ocean." Laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. They're asking us for help, after they chased us halfway across the system trying to kill us. They're not asking for help, Sarah corrected. They're asking for time, but it amounts to the same thing. She considered for a moment. They were weakened. Their fleet was devastated, but they still had 20 warships and the human defense fleet was barely in better shape. More importantly, there were survivors down on that planet. Crew members who'd ejected when their ships went down. They'd be in the ocean, in emergency capsules, hopping for rescue. Sarah had just killed thousands of them, but that didn't mean she wanted to leave survivors to die slowly. Tell them we agree to the ceasefire. 24 hours. They can search for their people and we won't fire on them, but if they make any aggressive moves, the deal is off. The message was sent. A few minutes later, the acknowledged. Sarah watched as they began deploying search and rescue craft toward the planet. It was surreal, watching the enemy she'd just been fighting now desperately trying to save their people from the same storm she'd used as a weapon. Think they'll keep the ceasefire? Torres asked. I think they're scared, Sarah said. We just destroyed most of their fleet with weather. They're wondering what else we can do, what other tricks we have, and right now they don't want to find out. Over the next day, they recovered what survivors they could from the ocean. It wasn't many. The storm had been too violent and the sea was still too rough. Most of the crew capsules had been destroyed or sunk. Sarah watched the rescue operations and felt a complicated mix of emotions. She'd won a battle, but the cost had been enormous on both sides. When the ceasefire ended, the fleet began to withdraw. They moved slowly, carefully, keeping their distance from the planet. Sarah expected them to regroup and attack again, but they continued accelerating toward the jump point. They were leaving, retreating. The Dominion, which had never lost a conquest campaign, was giving up on the 442 system. Admiral is on the line, the communications officer said. He wants to speak with you. Sarah accepted the call. Admiral appeared on the screen, a grizzled veteran who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last day. Commander, that was either the bravest or the thing I've ever seen a Terran officer do. Probably both, sir. 42 enemy ships destroyed. 0 human casualties. Do you have any idea what you've done? Won a battle, sir. You've changed the war, leaned back in his chair. High Command is going crazy. They are already broadcasting warnings to their other fleets. They're telling them to avoid atmospheric combat with human forces. They're calling you a weather witch. They think you can control storms. Sarah laughed despite herself. I can't control them, sir. I can just make them angrier. That's enough. The other species in the region are hearing about this. The reputation for invincibility just took a major hit. Suddenly, everyone is wondering if maybe they can be beaten after all. What about reinforcements? They will come back eventually. They will, but not here. Not to a water world with storms. You've created a class of planet they're now calling human weather worlds. Places where the atmospheric conditions are too dangerous for standard warship operations. Smiled grimly. High Command wants you to write up your tactics. They want to know if we can do this again. We can, Sarah said. As long as there's a planet with water and wind, we can fight them this way. It won't work everywhere, but it gives us an advantage in places where we didn't have one before. Good, because we need every advantage we can get. The war isn't over, Commander, but today you gave humanity hope. You showed the galaxy that we can fight back. The call ended. Sarah sat in her command chair, exhausted but unable to rest. Outside, the 442B continued to spin, its massive storm visible even from orbit. She'd turned it into a weapon, and in doing so, she'd shown the enemy what it meant to fight a species from Earth. Over the next few weeks, the story spread. The Battle of 442, where a handful of research vessels had destroyed a fleet using nothing but weather. Other species heard the story and started to reconsider the war. If the humans could weaponize storms, what else could they weaponize? What other tricks did they have? The Dominion issued new tactical guidelines. Avoid atmospheric combat with human forces. Don't chase them into storm systems. Be wary of water worlds. For the first time in their long history, they were fighting scared. 3 months later, the requested formal peace negotiations. The war had ground on, but they weren't winning anymore. Too many species had seen the battle and decided that maybe the Dominion wasn't invincible after all. Rebellions were breaking out on conquered worlds. They were overextended, and they knew it. The Treaty of was signed on the anniversary of the battle. Sarah attended the ceremony, along with her crew. The representative, War Admiral Al himself, came to the negotiations with his flagship still showing scars from the storm. "Commander," he said formally, the translator rendering his clicks and whistles into English. "You fought with great skill. You used tactics we had never encountered." "Thank you, War Admiral. You fought bravely as well." Al's crest rippled in what might have been amusement. "We fought foolishly. We underestimated you. We assumed that because your ships were weaker, your tactics would be conventional. We were wrong." "You underestimated our planet," Sarah corrected. "Earth taught us to fight with everything we have. We can't control the weather, but we understand it. We respect it. And when we needed to, we made it into a weapon." Al said slowly. "We have studied it now after the battle. Earth is classified as a Class 4 hazard world. Extreme weather, tectonic instability, high radiation levels in some regions. Most species would consider it barely habitable." "Most species aren't human." "Indeed." The War Admiral was quiet for a moment. "In our long history, we have conquered many species. Some fought with technology, others with numbers, a few with biological weapons or psychological warfare. But you are the first to fight us with your environment, the first to turn the sky itself into a weapon." He paused. "Tell me, Commander, if we had threatened Earth itself, what would you have done?" Sarah met his eyes. "Earth has hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis. We've survived all of them for millions of years. If you'd come to Earth, War Admiral, we would have buried you in weather that makes storm look gentle." Al's crest went flat against his head, a sign of fear or respect. "Maybe both. We will not make that mistake. The treaty will have a provision. Earth and all designated human weather worlds are neutral territory. The Dominion will not attempt conquest of any world where atmospheric conditions favor human tactics." "That's acceptable." The treaty was signed. The war was over, not because humanity had better weapons or more ships, but because they'd shown the galaxy something new. They'd shown that a species from a storm world could fight in ways no one expected. Sarah stood on the observation deck of the Tempest later that night, looking out at 442b. The superstorm was finally